Okay, thanks very much, Tony, and hello to everybody. We launched this project a couple of months ago from the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration. It's really the first major thing we've done since the summit in February, which many of you attended at Melbourne Town Hall, which a couple of thousand people turned up to. So I'm going to do a very brief presentation of this today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and go through some of this relatively quickly because it is online. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So it's at climaterealitycheck.net. It's listed down the bottom. It's a look at sort of 20 major issues that we're facing at the moment. It was reviewed by leading scientists and there's a full set of references. So if you go to the website, you can also download a PDF of the document, which will have all the references at the back. So I'm just going to skip through it fairly quickly. And if any groups want a longer presentation, I've been doing a lot of them, you know, almost one a day for the last month to various groups around the country. So happy to do that. Just to start with a little bit of a summary. The first thing is that global warming is now at least 1.2. In fact, this year's probably going to be close to 1.3, and 3 of the last 5 years have been over 1.2. So that's certainly the trajectory we're on, and the rate is accelerating. We are going to hit 1.5 before 2030, within the next 10 years. And I'll show you a slide soon with the evidence for that. The third thing is that if the current level of greenhouse gases were maintained, that is without any more emissions, and we just held it where we were, we get to 1.8 to 2 degrees of warming. The fourth thing is that we are likely to hit 2 degrees before 2050, even if there was substantially more ambition than has currently been promised at Paris. So this is obviously really the key issue. And lastly, you already know this, that with the current commitments from Paris, we're heading to 3 to 5 degrees of warming in the longer term, which is well understood as to be existential. That is inconsistent with the maintenance of human civilization. That doesn't mean humans won't be here, but the forms of organised society we now live in will come under severe pressure and will disintegrate. One of the first big issues, and this is really a challenge for us all, is in burning fossil fuels, we also, as a byproduct, produce a lot of sulfate aerosols, which stay in the atmosphere a very short period of time. But those aerosols have a really strong cooling impact, that what Jim Hansen called our Faustian bargain. And the problem is that as we reduce our fossil fuel use, perhaps if people could mute their microphones, there's a lot of noise coming through. Sorry. As we reduce our fossil fuel use, so will the amount of sulfates be reduced. Has everybody got muted? Excellent. As we reduce our fossil fuel use, so the amount of sulfates in the atmosphere will reduce, and so the amount of cooling we're getting of them will reduce as well. The consequence of this is that for the next 2 decades, lower emissions will have little impact on the warming trend. That is, for the next, I mean, obviously we have to go to zero fast because in the long term it's crucial, but for the next 2 decades, replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy will not affect the warming trend. And this is a staggering thing to understand because the cooling associated with fossil fuels is coming off. After 20-25 years, it does. But for the next 2 decades, as the heading says, reducing emissions alone will have no significant impact on the warming trend. So it's now very difficult for NGOs to go off and say, we're campaigning to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, and that will bring down the warming. Because for the next 20 years, that simply isn't true, and it means we've got to do more than just emissions. This can be seen in the models which are being produced for the next IPCC report. The climate models have been compared, so this is sort of a macro view. They have 3 emissions scenarios: continuing high emissions, central emissions, which is more cuts than has been promised in Paris, and then a low emission scenario. And what you can see is that in all those scenarios, we hit 1.5 in the next 6 or 7 years, and that even with more cuts than promised at Paris, we're still at 2 degrees by 2045. So that's the sort of area that we're heading into, which I mean is deeply concerning, and I'll explain why. As you already know, the current level of warming is 1.2. Paris talks about 1.5 to 2, but 1.5 is not safe. And we've talked about this many times before. The first point, obviously, is that 80% of the barrier reef is already gone over the last 40 years. It will bleach on an average of once every 3 to 4 years at the moment, and it takes more than a decade to recovery. So the barrier reef is in a death spiral and unlikely to be there in any recognisable form within 10 years. The second is that scientists say that the glaciers in the West Antarctica have already passed their tipping point. And an interesting article in The Guardian recently, melting Antarctic ice will raise sea levels by 2.5 metres even if Paris climate goals are met. So what The Guardian is saying is that the Paris goals will not stop Pacific islands from being inundated. And it's important to understand that that's actually where we are. And of course, in the Amazon, the forest system there now, the scientists say, is starting to oscillate between rainforest and being replaced by dry sclerophyll forest, because there is now less rain in the Amazon, obviously widespread clearing, more fires, and the Amazon is undergoing a transition. So all of this is simply to say that when we talk about 1.5 and particularly 2 degrees, to understand that that in that range is not safe. So a very quick look at the tipping points from this map. First of all, the 3 red triangles, you can see the Arctic sea ice, coral reefs and West Antarctic ice sheet have already passed their tipping points at 1.2 degrees. The next 4, the orange circles, the Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon, certainly, and the Atlantic circulation, the Gulf Stream, are already precarious. The Gulf Stream's already slowed 15%, and scientists are getting increasingly worried about parts of East Antarctica as well. Certainly in the next 10 years, we are likely to see scientists say we have passed the tipping point for Greenland and the tipping point for the Amazon within the next 10 years by 1.5 degrees. And of course, the 2 big ones were the big carbon stores, permafrost and the boreal forest in Canada, are not yet critical, but they are changing, and they will become more active as the Arctic warms. I'll come back to that. The most important paper probably for a long time is the Hothouse Earth paper put out 2 years ago. The lead author was Phil Steffen from Australia, and they talked about those tipping points we've seen in the previous map, and they said that the Hothouse Earth scenario is one in which the system feedbacks, for example, Arctic warming mobilises the permafrost releases carbon, that carbon warms the atmosphere more, and you get this unvirtuous cycle, that the system tipping points and their mutual interaction, how they interact with each other, as we saw on that map, drive the Earth system to what they call a point of no return, which they define as further warming would become self-sustaining, that is, without human effort. That is, even if humans stop their emissions, the Earth system itself would keep on warming through its own feedbacks. And secondly, they said this threshold for Hothouse Earth could exist at a temperature rise as low as 2 degrees. And they said even possibly in the range of 1.5 to 2. And obviously we're going to be at 1.5 in 10 years. So this is not a hypothetical future. This is now a very practical risk. I think that the biggest issue for the climate movement today should be to understand what is a Hothouse Earth scenario, how fast, how far away is it, what are the risks, and what do we have to do to avoid it? And it's more than stopping emissions. It's also drawdown and cooling, because emissions alone, as we've seen from the previous slide, will not stop us sliding past 1.5 and perhaps past 2 degrees as well. And in fact, the Hothouse Earth paper is the most downloaded paper in the history of climate science research publishing. And the German Linguistics Foundation declared the German word for hothouse as to be their word of the year. So this is a significant thing. And more recently, some of the authors who wrote that paper wrote a new paper called Too Risky to Bet Against. And I think this sentence really summarises where we are. And, you know, many of us have been campaigning for understanding climate as a planetary emergency with existential risks. So here are some of the world's leading scientists saying, and I quote, "The evidence from tipping points alone suggests we are already in a state of planetary emergency. Both the risk and the urgency are acute. If damaging tipping cascades can occur and a global tipping point cannot be ruled out, then this is an existential threat to civilization." This is the one quote we should print on the post and give to every politician when we meet them. This is the clearest statement of where we're going. So what do we need to do about this? Obviously, we need to get to zero fast by 2030, not 2050. Long-term targets are an excuse for procrastination. Talking about 2050 doesn't put any pressure on Scott Morrison. He can come up 3 months before the election and say, "I agree with zero 2050 and pretend to be climate hero," and there'll be no comeback on him, because 2050 is simply past the point that is really of concern. We're already close to hot out the Earth scenario. We're going to be past 1.5 before 2030. We're likely to be past 2 degrees by 2040 or 2045. So I don't understand why most of the climate boom wants to talk about 2050. In any case, if you take an equal per capita emissions right to the so-called IPCC carbon budget, Australia's carbon budget runs out in 2025. And the only way you can justify emissions past that is not if you have a climate justice position, but an anti-climate justice position. The second thing, and so Ian Dunlop and I had an article in the Canberra Times recently saying that advocating zero 2050 is climate colonialism, which it is. That rich white people have a greater right to emissions than anybody else in the world. The second thing we obviously need to do is to draw down carbon from the atmosphere, because the current level is enough to produce a 25-metre sea level rise. This is material we've talked about often before, whether it be restorative agriculture, restoring degraded rainforests, wetlands, or new technologies. Drawdown is absolutely essential. And after emissions has got to be the second lever that we talk about. And one of the really encouraging things was just recently, in fact, Friday of last week, there was a letter signed by a whole lot of important people, including James Hansen, Professor Michael Mann, the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Monbiot and others, in The Guardian, saying hitting net zero is not enough, we must restore the climate. And it was really an appeal to understand that drawdown was important. So I think that's a really important statement in The Guardian on the 13th of November, and it was headed, "Hitting net zero is not enough, we must restore the climate," and is a very valuable resource for us to use. The third lever after emissions going to zero and drawdown is trying to find a way to cool the planet. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a moment, because it is clear that things are already too hot. Things are close to getting out of control. And if there is some way, so solar radiation management using aerosols works, because that's what fossil fuels have been doing, pouring aerosols in the atmosphere, and they've been cooling the planet. So do volcanoes. They have had the same effect. It's a tricky area, because the researchers have not yet been able to demonstrate that it is of net environmental and social benefit, but I think we really have to look and hope that some form of cooling is possible, because if not, I fear we're in dire trouble. And I'm going to explain why. Don't worry about this diagram, it's something I'm working on at the moment. But if we look at the Arctic's warming 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. That's causing 3 things. It's causing the loss of the Arctic sea ice in summer. So reflective ice is being replaced by dark water, and the reflection is changing. That's adding heat back into the Arctic. The second thing is that the jet stream is destabilising, so you're getting extreme heat events in the Arctic like we saw this year. And the third thing is the Greenland ice sheet is melting. That's what we know now. Scientists are now saying that these processes are leading to what they call abrupt Arctic change. And so in the bottom half of this diagram, we talk about what would likely happen in the next 10 years. So this is to 2030. The first thing is that Greenland will pass its tipping point. It's thought to be around about 1.6 degrees. If Greenland starts melting more rapidly, it will slow down the Gulf Stream. The slowdown of the Gulf Stream will result in further drying of the Amazon and, I think, push the Amazon past the tipping point. So that's one consequence. The second is that obviously the world in the next 10 years will get past 1.5. That and this huge amount of heat now in the Arctic means that we will have a summer in the next 10 years where there's no sea ice left in the Arctic, what's called the blue water event. That will again produce large amounts of extra heat into the Arctic. And according to the evidence, which says a tipping point for permafrost may be about 1.5 degrees, these processes of rapid change of the blue water event and the large amount of heat will all drive us to a point where the permafrost becomes mobilised and active and its melting becomes self-sustaining, which is a definition of the hothouse Earth dynamic. So that's just a schema of what I fear will happen in the next 10 years. And this is obviously one of the reasons why trying to find ways to cool a system, particularly the Arctic, is important. In fact, the former chief scientist in the UK, Sir David King, has now got a project at Cambridge University called the Centre for Climate Repair. And their first project is a report coming out soon on possible ways of cooling the Arctic. So this is the third active area. So emissions reduction, number one, drawdown two, and what can we do to cool, particularly the most vulnerable ecosystems, climate systems such as this one, to stop the dynamic. The Arctic, in summary, is undergoing abrupt climate change. That's peer-reviewed science. This is probably the most important thing I can say. Scientists fear, more privately than publicly, that Arctic dynamics will, this decade, create the conditions for the hothouse Earth scenario. That's their great fear. And Jim Hansen, 10 years ago, said, if you want to stabilise the Arctic, CO2 needs to be 300 to 325 parts per million, and we're now over 400. So this is really, good evidence as to why drawdown is so important if we're going to stabilise these systems. So the conclusions: cooling the Arctic now is crucial, absolutely crucial to mitigating the hothouse Earth risk, and large-scale drawdown is essential to stabilising the Arctic. And I think it's really unfortunate that many of the large groups in the climate movement simply won't say these things, which to me are scientifically obvious and important to be said and understood. Because if policymakers don't understand this, then we're on a very bad political trajectory. The summary from our report, and this is just a very brief version of it, is that COVID actually showed us that societies that are successfully overcoming the pandemic did so by making COVID the highest priority of politics and economics. Will Stephan, a couple of years ago, said we need to make climate the highest priority of politics and economics, which I think is quite a good definition of what climate emergency is. And we saw during COVID, that's exactly what we did. Other issues were pushed to one side in order to deal with COVID. So our lesson out of this is that making action on climate disruption the highest priority of government is the key to protecting people, society and nature, because climate is a much bigger threat than COVID, but it's getting much less action. And obviously the 5 conclusions: we have to assess the risks with brutal honesty, recognise that this requires an emergency plan, and the 3 points are already made: act fast for zero by 2030, build capacity to draw down, and work out what role cooling can play in saving the situation. Very briefly, last slide, some conclusions. Our situation is unprecedented in human history, and we may have to do things differently than we've ever done them before. Existing models of politics and economics simply may not work in these circumstances. Number 2, the COVID response does show a way forward. All sorts of political orthodoxies, whether they be balanced budgets or neoliberalism, or the government can't intervene, or you can't restrict people's movements or actions when there's a crisis, or thrown out the window. And Here in Australia, we're really pleased that they were, because we're now essentially back to zero domestic transmission of COVID. The third thing is that making action on climate disruption the highest priority of government must be our demand. The highest priority of government. And the fourth one, reflecting on this, and I've checked this out with a few other people, is that there's a profound ignorance. The sort of material I've just talked to about, and as I said, there's a longer version of this on the Climate Reality Check 2020 website. It's my view that there is not a single federal MP, a single director of a top 200 company in Australia, or a single person at the executive level of the Australian Public Service who acknowledges the full reality of the crisis or articulates the risks as we have described in Climate Reality Check. And various NGOs I've talked to about this said, unfortunately, they think that's probably true. So we're also dealing with a situation of profound ignorance at the elite levels in this country. I'm happy to provide that PowerPoint to anybody who wants it. Most of you have my email address, and as I said, the full PowerPoint and the report is available at Climate Reality Check 2020, and we're also happy to do presentations to any groups of people who want it. So thanks very much for your time.